My name is Mark Chubb. I'm the technical director for the Institution of Fire Engineers. I'd like to start by thanking Firebuyer Live for inviting me to come along and speak with you today about wildland fire risk and the changing climate of wildland fire across the world. Today, I'll be focusing on the changes in policy, not products, and talking a little bit about how our efforts to introduce new technologies haven't necessarily put us where we'd like to be with respect to wildland fire risk. Since I'm from the United States, the history here is something I'm much more familiar with than the global history of fire. And I always reflect on this because the U.S. has been seen in many respects as a leader in wildland fire management. But the landscape that we face here hasn't changed much since 1871. On October 8th, 1871, we actually had two great fires, one in Chicago, which destroyed most of what was then one of America's largest cities and killed 300 people, consumed about 2,000 acres of land and hundreds of buildings. But just a few hundred miles north of there, near Peshtigo, Wisconsin, close to what's modern-day Green Bay, another fire occurred, and it killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people and burned 1.2 million acres, or nearly half a million hectares of land. After the 1871 fire in Chicago, the United States undertook many efforts to reduce urban fire risk. We adopted modern building codes. We instituted professional fire services in our major cities. We undertook land use controls. Many things changed, and urban conflagrations are all but unknown today. Most major fires in urban areas are confined to a single building, and while some of them do kill dozens of people from time to time, the risk of mass urban conflagration wiping out a city is all but unknown. At the same time, wildland urban conflagrations like the Peshtigo fire are occurring with increasing frequency and arguably with increasing severity. The landscape we face today is probably best characterized by a recent fire in December 2021 outside Denver, Colorado, in a town called Boulder. About the same time as the Marshall Fire, researchers were publishing an update on the anticipated impact of climate change on wildland fire risk globally. Their report highlights some of the stark increases in incidence and severity we can expect due to an ever-warming climate. Their projections suggest that we could see an almost doubling of the incidence and consequence of fires in boreal forest regions around the globe, and at least a 25% increase in other temperate zones. That would remarkably affect our capacity to manage wildland fire risk, especially as urban areas encroach on areas that were traditionally not urbanized. So what's leading to all of this? Well, the trend that's probably contributing most to the increased risk of fire, aside from climate change, is urban sprawl. In the United States, for instance, we've moved over the past century from a land use pattern that was roughly 50-50 rural, agricultural, and urban to nearly 75% of our citizens living in and around urban areas, with only 25% still living in rural or agricultural regions. Almost 90% of those people live somewhere within 90 minutes of the coast of the United States. So again, we're seeing a concentration of population in areas that have historically been prone to wildland fire risk. During the pandemic, we saw a slight reversal of that trend, but not enough to change the overall drive towards urban sprawl. In that trend, what we saw were fewer people staying in concentrated urban centers and more moving out into the fringe of ex-urban areas and rural areas that had once been depopulated. Again, that's been shifting our wildland fire risk from the edges of urban areas into areas that are just on the fringe of the fringe. Another trend that we've seen here in the United States and which has been noted elsewhere in the world is the effect of aggressive wildland firefighting tactics. For more than a century, the United States had a fire policy in wildland areas to aggressively attack and suppress fires in wildland areas. This was largely driven by not by conservation values, but by uh, the drive to urbanize to have productive forests. Wildland fires were seen as destruction of capital, and aggressive firefighting tactics were a way of protecting wildland and timber losses. But aggressive firefighting has removed a once vital part of the wildland ecosystem from its normal function, which was clearing out invasive species, reducing fuel accumulations, and promoting biodiversity in the forest. As a result, climate change has exacerbated the effects of all of these trends and made urban wildland fire risk an ever more pressing concern. In response to those trends, most countries have attempted to adopt strategies very similar to the ones that led to a dramatic reduction in urban conflagration risk. Insurance played a key role in privatizing or internalizing the costs of poor fire management practices in the urban environment. And we've tried to introduce insurance risk management tools into the wildland fire risk landscape as well, but with mixed success. In some cases, insurers have been aggressive in reintroducing firefighting and exposure protection, and essentially sending commercial fire forces in with public fire forces to protect properties that they consider at risk. In other cases, they've placed high risk premiums on policies in wildland interface areas. And in other cases, they've declined to provide cover at all. In response to that, government is attempted to improve risk communication of wildland urban fire risk by introducing mapping tools similar to those that have been used to highlight seismic and flood risks. But wildland fire risk mapping has proven even more controversial than flood mapping and seismic risk mapping, in that it's been seen to devalue property that was once considered a premium. Finally, we've seen a lot of opposition to fuel reduction burns. Having removed fire by aggressively fighting natural fires, we've seen a need to reintroduce fire in a managed way to reduce fuel accumulations, especially in areas where there's a population or property risk. Along the way, we've introduced a number of new products to reduce wildland fire risk. Those have included wetting agents, water additives, foam, Class A foam. We've used a number of different practices to improve the efficiency of firefighting and to improve our capability to protect exposed property. Probably the most dramatic thing that's happened in terms of wildland fire management has been the use of enhanced aerial firefighting capabilities. That's taken the form of fixed and rotary wing aircraft, which have increased in scale progressively from drop buckets underneath helicopters to KC-10 aircraft outfitted for fire retardant drops. So why are these trends persisting in the way that they have? As I said at the outset, our efforts to reduce urban fire risk from the 19th century onward were largely successful, but our efforts over that same time period to combat urban wildland fire risk have proven much more uneven and challenging. Part of the reason for this is that it's much more difficult to internalize fire risks in the urban wildland interface than it was in the urban environment. Part of this is due to the sacred cow nature of wild landscapes. We treasure the views that we have in these areas. We treasure the natural value of these landscapes, but we also place a premium on the independence of property owners and the ability to manage one's own risk. Unfortunately, fire risk, like many other catastrophic risks, is very difficult for people to define. Urban fire risk, on the other hand, tends to be a much more clear-cut and contemporary problem for people. So in the U.S., we've attempted to introduce fire risk mapping, as I said, and the principal pushback on that has been that knowing what your fire risk is decreases your property value. A property that was once seen as a prized or premium value property because of its proximity to natural landscapes is now seen as a diminished asset because of the risk from urban wildland conflagration. We've had a lot of pushback on structural defenses or shelter hardening. Many people who've built in the wildland urban interface have built from materials that integrate well with the natural landscape. But of course, those materials, like the landscapes in which the buildings are located, are highly flammable. The pushback here has been, who wants to live in a bunker? If I wanted to live in a concrete jungle, I would have stayed in the city. And that raises the other issue that when we try to push for defensible space and ways to protect properties from adjacent wildland fires, we hear a lot of pushback from people about habitat preservation, diminished amenity value, and the utility of living in wild places where the trees are the view. And as I said earlier, insurance continues to produce some moral hazard problems. Insurance has been a double-edged sword. In the urban landscape, we did see the value of insurance in privatizing risks, costs, and benefits, but it's also allowed for some moral hazard problems in that once people have insurance, they're more likely to accept a higher risk appetite than they would have had they borne more of the risk themselves. Of course, with flood insurance here in the United States and other catastrophic risks around the globe, we see government stepping in many cases to backstop insurance markets to essentially provide a form of reinsurance, which has also made it much more complicated to pass the costs on to the property owners who really own the risk. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, one of the most important ones for us to recognize is that the costs of fire risk reduction, as with the costs of fire risk itself, are not shared evenly, but they must be shared more widely if we're to make any progress. The more concentrated the risks and costs, the less likely it is we'll make progress on the policy front. The benefits of reducing fire risk in the urban wildland interface must be pushed down in order to make the marginal cost lower than the prospective gain. One of the things we've learned with seismic risk reduction around the world is that even when the risk of a catastrophic consequence is considered nearly certain, people resist the upgrade of buildings largely because they fear two things. One, the diminished amenity value in the short term, and the reduced prospect or the uncertain prospect of gain over the foreseeable future. Here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, we have a catastrophic earthquake risk of about 1 in 500 years, having an earthquake capable of destroying most well-built buildings. Yet we see strong resistance to increased seismic standards, especially standards for improving the resilience of existing buildings, because the risk is so low that on an annualized basis, the prospect of a catastrophic earthquake is viewed as being about 0.2%. The other emphasis that's really complicated things for us when we thought they were actually going to help us was the increased premium on green construction. Green construction it has focused on emission reduction, and it's focused on climate adaptations, but it's also encouraged people to build in places that were once considered undesirable from a cost of construction standpoint. And what we're seeing with green technology in particular is a shift from an emphasis on fossil fuel consumption to electrification. And the electrification trend has introduced new risks into buildings, which have also also changes the risk landscape in and around wildland areas. Now, we know that moving from urban areas to wildland areas always involves a change in risk, but it doesn't necessarily change risk perception. One of the biggest problems we've experienced in the Western United States, especially with urban sprawl and deurbanization, is the trend of people in highly concentrated urban areas accustomed to high levels of fire service to move into increasingly rural areas and expect the same level of firefighting and emergency response capability that they enjoyed when they lived in a more densely populated area. One thing we can say for certain, based on the current trends, is that our fire response capability will never exceed the wildland fire hazard and fire risk. It's become increasingly clear that even well-staffed, well-equipped, well-trained fire services around the globe are simply powerless in the face of massive wildland conflagrations. In most cases, we do the same thing in the wildland interface area that we do in urban areas. We wait for the fire to get small enough or turn back on itself and consume fuel before we can actually go in and suppress the fire. So what's this leave us with? It leaves us with the realization that the most aggressive fire risk management is going to have to start with individual homeowners and individual land managers, not firefighters. And for that to happen, we're going to have a shift in public attitudes, and with that, a shift in public policy. So moving on and focusing on the future, the institution of fire engineers and other partners recognize that the connection between wildland fire risk and climate change is real. We've adopted a climate action, resilience, and sustainability agenda to step up efforts to mitigate carbon emissions. But we've also had to recognize that despite best efforts, our reductions in carbon emissions and our efforts to move towards a net zero economy are not going to come fast enough to prevent us from having to make other investments to normalize adaptations to climate change. That means increasing public awareness, not just of fire risk, but of the very real need for risk reduction measures, increasing the public acceptance of fire-resistant construction practices, particularly in areas with significant wildland fire risk and fire hazard, an increased emphasis on defensible space, which doesn't necessarily mean no vegetation between homes or buildings and trees, but managed vegetation that's more resistant to fire spread. And of course, we're going to need to work doubly hard to gain public acceptance for the use of prescribed fire and hazard reduction burns, especially in and around populated areas. Finally, one of the things that's become increasingly clear as we look at the changing landscape, the areas that are now the most likely to increase in fire risk in the coming decades, we can't separate climate change and our efforts to respond to climate change from issues of environmental justice. One thing that's become increasingly clear as we've watched new areas become exposed to fire risk is that the people who are paying the consequences of fire risk and loss are often those who are least well equipped to handle those losses. This is especially true in areas where deforestation has already been occurring, but is now accelerating as the quest for resources accelerates. With the accelerated deforestation, of course, we see the accelerated consequence of fire impacts around the world. Finally, it's a sobering fact, but the most vulnerable in our society have always increased or always faced a greater fire risk than those with more resources. And one of our responsibilities as an institution is to advocate for those in the most vulnerable position, as well as for those best able to take care of themselves. So I want to leave it there and open the floor for questions. Thank you again to Firebuyer Live for inviting me to talk to you today about wildland fire risk and the intersection with climate change.
So thank you, Mark, for providing an informative session on wildfires and the equipment and practices that are needed to fight these types of fires. So what is the IFE doing to help tackle the issue of lack of awareness? And how can organisations and individuals get involved to help promote this change?
Well, I think the most important thing we've done is establish a board-led process for raising the net zero and climate change agenda within the institution, both in terms of how we respond as a corporate body, but also in terms of informing and equipping our members to deal with this. And we call it climate action, resilience, and sustainability, or IFE cares. And what we're trying to do with that initiative is make information about wildland fire risks, about climate adaptation more accessible to our members. And what that means in really practical terms is that our technical committee has charged our special interest groups and branches with specific responsibilities for developing resources tailored to different interest groups within the IFE membership and different geographies around the globe. Because climate impacts are not the same globally. There is a single trend, but the way that say New Zealand experiences the impact of climate change, as we've seen in recent weeks, maybe flooding, whereas parts of the western U.S. will see increased drought and increased wildland fire risk.
And how do wildfires and firefighting tactics change and differ depending on the geographical locations?
Well, I think the biggest difference that I've seen, having worked across the globe, is that economies change wildland firefighting tactics and in bigger ways than firefighting forces themselves. In places that are very heavily reliant on volunteer labor for firefighting, the level of technology employed against fires is decidedly more primitive. At the same time, we've tried to backstop that in places like Australia with increased aerial firefighting capability. We've seen the introduction of what we call large air tankers and very large air tankers. The KC-10 platform, for instance, was deployed here in the United States for aerial firefighting with retardant drops. I think we're going to see a scaling back of that because of economic concerns. But it's interesting to note that there seems to be a clear dichotomy between what I would call wet firefighting and dry firefighting in terms of the way that different parts of the world engage in fire attack. Here in the U.S., we've tended to use what I call the dry tactic, which is removing fuel ahead of the fire, building fuel breaks. Whereas when I worked in Australasia, we were much more aggressive with wet firefighting, using aerial tactics, handheld hose lines, and other exposure protection measures. The climate, the terrain, and the economy probably have the biggest impacts on the variations we see around the globe in firefighting.
And you spoke about in your session new types of apparatus and vehicle equipment that are being used to tackle these wildland fires. Does this pose an issue with fire department funding or fire services that are potentially less developed?
Well, it certainly does. As I said, economics drive firefighting capabilities quite significantly. And while we see professional fire services expanding around the globe, the scale of the urban wildland interface problem and the wildland fire problem has meant that almost every region of the world is dependent upon volunteer labor for firefighting. In areas where aggressive wet firefighting tactics are common, we've seen increased use of water tenders, and we've seen increased reliance on light attack vehicles for exposure protection. At the same time, to support them, we've seen an increased reliance on aerial deployment, so helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft. Of course, that creates a pretty stark dichotomy between the volunteer, relatively unskilled labor that's deployed with hand tools and the highly skilled pilots and aerial fire managers required to support them and create a safe operating environment for them. I think the areas where I've seen the most increase in technological advancement has been in terms of understanding wildland fire behavior, weather prediction, and remote sensing capability, so that the intelligence of firefighters on the ground about conditions and about potential changes in fire behavior are being communicated in near real time and they're better equipped to make changes or withdraw from areas where the risk becomes unacceptable.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Mark. I really appreciate it. If you have any other further questions for Mark about his session or for the IFE and their efforts in tackling wildfires, please visit the IFE stand in the exhibitor section of the platform to catch up with a member of the team. Thank you.